All right, welcome to another video. I'm Chantel,
And I'm Amber.
and today we're going to be talking about The Simple Wild and It Happened One Summer. So, if you haven't read The Simple Wild by K.A. Tucker, it's about this slightly spoiled girl named Calla who lives in Canada. And one day after she got fired and she found out her boyfriend was cheating on her, she also gets a phone call that her dad, who she hasn't talked to for years, has been diagnosed with cancer. And so she has this opportunity to reconnect with him while he's undergoing treatments and things like that. So she flies all the way to Alaska, in the middle of nowhere town where her pilot, his name is Jonah, and they kind of don't hit it off at all because it's a classic like grumpy sunshine trope. So The Simple Wild tells the story of Calla and Jonah getting to know one another, and Calla also reconnecting with her dad, and figuring out the hardships that come with that.
On a similar storyline, It Happened One Summer is about Piper Bellinger, who is a spoiled social media influencer who's kind of Hollywood famous adjacent. And um, she gets herself into trouble, and her stepdad is sick of her childish ways and says, I am exiling you to the town you were born in middle of nowhere, Washington. Um, And that's where like her mother met her father and where he died. In the process, she meets Brandon, who automatically does not like her upon first sight. And it's about like their love story as they overcome their dislike for each other.
That I thought was really fascinating. When Amber and I were both reading this, my initial reaction was like, this is almost identical to Happened One Summer, which is why we're doing this video, is because there's a lot of similarities between the plots.
Let's talk about some of our favorite scenes from The Simple Wild that are kind of similar to It Happened One Summer. They're just great showcases of how K.A. Tucker developed the characters and developed their relationship versus how Tessa Bailey handled it. So starting off in The Simple Wild, Calla goes and asks Jonah for a ride to the grocery store, and by ask, she really just demanded like, "Hey, drive me." She has a bit of like sticker shock, culture shock to Alaska because she didn't realize like how difficult it is to get products to the middle of nowhere, Alaska, how expensive those products are, and what she would consider a necessity is something that they would consider a luxury item. Jonah calls her out on her stuff and is like, hey, you're acting like a spoiled princess right now. Like, you need to take a look around and get an understanding of what life is like here. In contrast, Piper goes to the grocery store, possibly for the first time in her entire life, runs into Brandon. He helpfully is like, here, buy spaghetti and meat, and you can make spaghetti sauce. Like, no one can screw that up.
And then she almost sets her apartment on fire.
K. Tucker set Calla up to evolve and do so with the help slash encouragement from
Jonah?
Jonah rather than like how Tessa had the characters interact. It was just more of a surface level, hey, you're kind of an idiot interaction. I also wanted to touch more on like the dangerous jobs. Like, since they both shared dangerous jobs, Brendan is a crab fisherman who tries to get hauls in, and Jonah is a bush pilot who often will go out and take risks in order to deliver goods to remote villages or do rescue flights, that kind of thing. And I really appreciated how Kay Tucker used his dangerous job to help Calla gain understanding of her father and his lifestyle, but also that empathy aspect of understanding why someone would be willing to risk their life to do that job and what it means to a community to have someone do that versus like the interactions that Piper has with Brendan about his dangerous job. It's very much surface level. She never really tries to get to understand why he does what he does or why it makes a difference that he's the captain of his ship, or like there's just no depth to the exploration of such a big part of his life.
Right at the beginning, Jonah actually gets in a plane crash, and you can see her realize for the first time how terrifying it is to have someone in a like dangerous job, and how she actually has already started to care for him in a way. Um, but she doesn't ever try to be like, well, you can't fly anymore, right? Or like, no, this is like too scary, you can't do that. Whereas Piper and Brendan don't actually reach that connection, right? She's more like, well, why you're leaving me kind of mentality, because she doesn't realize what's behind it. Because in a way, while Brendan is like the captain of his ship and the entire town is built on the crabbing and the fishing, it doesn't quite put the like feelings behind his job as much as the Simple Wild did. And I think because of that, we lost a lot of opportunity for growth between Piper and Brendan to actually, be a couple and to have that fear of like every day I might lose someone, or I might not be able, like he might not come home like my dad did, or things like that, right? So I think that is why the Simple Wild did it better than It Happened One Summer, because it put actual emotion into it and like real life feelings that people have when they're in relationships.
I think that's one of the reasons we like this book, The Simple Wild, so much, is because the relationship feels so real and very believable, whereas It Happened One Summer is very surface level.
I think that's what's so fascinating about a lot of the smut books and BookTok books right now is if you look at it and if you were to like remove the characters from their plots, would they actually last past the epilogue? So, for example, like Brendan and Piper, they feel a lot more like a one night stand to me, whereas Calla and Jonah, smut actually complements their relationship really well,
Yeah.
because they have that foundation of trust and they have the chemistry. And both characters in the books have a very physical reaction to their love interest. Cal and Jonah both acknowledge that this is not a good idea, repeatedly throughout the book. And then they start becoming more friends, and then eventually they do actually fall in love. Whereas with Piper and Brendan, there's very obviously like a physical connection between the two, and they go for it despite the fact, and they both kind of know that it's not good long term. And I think that's very fascinating to like compare and contrast those two relationships because they have such a similar background.
Expectation of end date and like
Yes.
temporariness, but the way the authors wrote the characters' mentalities about that end date is vastly different, right? Like you were saying, both Jonah and Calla went in knowing like not a good idea. It's gonna end. This is probably gonna cause us more pain than if we continue. And they chose to go forward anyways. And then Brendan and Piper, like Piper pushes for the physical instead of just developing her like friendship with him. And he is kind of in the like, I'm just going to take what I can get and not really think about the consequences of those choices and how it will impact them.
Which is valid. I mean, that does happen in relationships quite frequently. But I think the intent behind those relationships is what ends up mattering. And so, if you go into a relationship being like, well, I don't know if this is going to work out long term, that's fine. But there's a certain level, like a connotation with those relationships, than ones where like, oh, I actually could see myself dating this guy long term, which I think plays right into like our thoughts about how one is a healthy relationship and one isn't. And Calla and Jonah definitely have more of a healthy relationship. You can see that throughout the development of the book, but also in how they like respond to problems and challenges and grief. And yes, is Calla slightly spoiled? Absolutely. But she's also never known different. So I love that Jonah is patient with her in showing her, like, one, there's another world out there, but also, two, he understands where she's coming from. So he doesn't try to like belittle her. Even in a way, like, he doesn't try and fix the problem for her. Whereas with Brendan and Piper, it's also very similar, right? Like, she comes from spoiled princess kind of mentality. But Brendan actually tries to fix a lot of her problems for her, as opposed to letting her kind of struggle and learn how it is herself. And he doesn't quite play the empathy card as much as Jonah did, which is what I really loved about The Simple Wild, because there were so many examples of them being healthy and actually like showing us what we should emulate in our personal relationships.
even though both books put the characters in these positions where they know they shouldn't enter into the relationship, they both are kind of trying to fight the attraction they feel on some level. Like it happened one summer, they give in to that chemistry very quickly without actually developing a friendship or respect for each other. Whereas the Simple Wild, Jonah and Kala actually get to know each other on that deeper level first. They become friends almost.
I guess they're allies, I would almost say. Maybe not entirely friends at the beginning, right? But they are allies. Whereas Piper and Brendan, they're just a chemical relationship. It's not
Yeah.
really an actual relationship. It's just the physical side of it. And there are developments on the flip side of them working together slightly, but it's not near as 3D as it is with other books. But I think what's really fascinating is It Happened When Summer had the groundwork for an actually slightly more emotional based book because she finally had an opportunity to reconnect with her dad's legacy, right?
The Simple Wild deals heavily with loss of a parent, but loss of a parent in two different ways. One being a severed relationship when her parents' relationship ended, she went years without talking to him again. And then with the cancer, like it's the fear of reconnecting with him and developing a relationship and then dealing with the consequences of what if he does actually die from cancer after I develop this relationship. Whereas It Happened One Summer still is dealing with kind of the grief of losing a parent. But in Piper's case, like her father died when she was 2, and she doesn't really have any memories of him at all. And she doesn't really get the opportunity to get to know him and develop a relationship with him.
So the groundwork was there for Piper to reconnect in a way with her dad, or at least her dad's memory and her dad's legacy, and kind of get to know him through the people around him. I mean, their city has like a statue dedicated to him. So he was a core lifeblood in the community. And her grandma lives in the town. And while she does make the steps to reconnect with her grandma, it's it's not done in necessarily an emotional way. It's more done in a like, oh, I'm slightly curious, but not entirely in the like wanting to reconnect. Whereas the Simple Wild developed that emotional connection way more. And I think that is why, again, like it was the better book of the two because it sucked you in as a reader. Because grief of any sort, right? Or reconnecting or things like that, those are feelings that at its core are, are things that all of us feel at one point or another throughout our life. So maybe it's not the exact scenario, right? But the root emotion is something that all of us have felt or will feel. And so that's why I think The Simple Wild is a book that we'll both go back to over and over again because it created that personal connection with the characters.
Well, and I'm excited to actually read the second book because the way that The Simple Wild ended was on somewhat of a
Cliffhanger.
cliffhanger, and you're just like, well, what what actually comes next? Like, how does their relationship go from here? Whereas It Happened One Summer, like, is part of a duology, but the second book is Hannah and Brendan's best
Fox?
friend Fox's story, right? Instead of continuing talking about like how their relationship develops. So in classic rom-com slash smut um, writing, the epilogue is just like, oh, they live happily ever after. And you're like, but do they really?
Okay, we're going to talk about the ending. So if you haven't read those books and want to, you might want to like pause the video or come back to it later because we got to talk about the endings because the endings are also really similar between the two books.
Right? Because they both have the main female character, Piper and Calla, leaving the small town and going back to their homes. And kind of with the expectation that the relationship is over. And
And then the guy shows up.
right. And it again, that difference in timeline is really important, I think, especially in Kala and Jonah's story, because there's actually time that passes in their relationship ending and her returning to Canada versus Piper and Brendan, he basically just follows her straight there and
I
tries
think
to
theirs
get
is
her
like a
back.
week apart, if that. Whereas
Right.
Cal and Jonah, it was 2 months.
And it just difference in maturity and like approach from the authors, where the characters in both of these books are very similar in age, but you see a vast difference in how they behave. And I think the ending just really showcases that, because there is kind of that acceptance from Jonah and Calla to some degree of like, well, we knew it was going to be like this. We made that choice and now we have to deal with it until Jonah shows up on our doorstep.
I also really love the whole Jonah and Calla scene simply because I don't know, there's something like super butterfly inducing and swoon worthy when they're both like, you know, we both fizzled out and like we both thought this was over. And then Jonah coming and being like, I can't live without you. So I'm willing to compromise and figure things out. And she's like, same. Right. And I think that is what like just puts a perfect little bow on the relationship because that happens in real life, right? When you realize like you want to pursue this despite everyone and everything saying like this isn't going to work out long term or it's not going to be as easy. I think those are the relationships worth pursuing. Whereas with Piper and Brendan, their relationship is easy, right? None of them, like, she ends up moving back to the small town with him, but like, he doesn't have to give up his job. Like, no compromise happens. Whereas with Calla and Jonah, compromise happens, and compromise is the root of a relationship, especially a healthy one. Like, you have to make sacrifices for the other person if you want your relationship to last. So I love that factor of the simple wild is
Yeah.
they both give stuff up, whereas it happened when Summer doesn't happen. Like, sure, Piper leaves Hollywood, but she takes literally like her fortune with her, all like her tons of clothes. Brendan also is super rich, so he can support her crazy lifestyle, which was slightly annoying. But
Right.
yeah,
And that's kind of the part that lends more reality to the simple wild, right? Like it feels like a realistic story. It feels like this is somebody you could meet in real life if you went to Alaska or um, came across a bush pilot or something. Like this could actually be real
real.
versus it happened one summer feels very contrived. Like how the characters are written, and she maybe watched some documentary styled shows about crab fishing to get like the barest minimum understanding. Whereas I believe K.A. Tucker actually took the time to learn about life in Alaska and bush pilots and what it means to live in a remote place like that, and focused on rooting it in reality.
So, in conclusion, between It Happened One Summer and The Simple Wild, we would 100% recommend The Simple Wild by K.A. Tucker. It is worth your time. I
5-star read from both of us.
absolutely, definitely a book that we'll both go back to multiple times.